Leave the noise of the day behind. Tonight, the galaxy is just a gentle light in the distance. Close your eyes, find your comfort, and let the silence hold you. Subscribe, and you'll always have a new chapter waiting whenever you need it. The universe is quiet tonight. You are safe here. Let your breathing slow down, matching the slow turn of the stars. Let's drift together into the story of the cosmos. South pole of the earth, the corresponding pole of the heavens rises higher and higher above the horizon. In latitude, some degrees north, or 1/3 of the way from the equator to the pole of the heavens is raised 1/3 of the way from the horizon to the point vertically overhead. Time equals 3,500 milliseconds greater than, and when this is the case, the observer knows that he is in latitude some degrees. The builders of the Great Pyramid, with the almost constantly clear skies of Egypt, may reasonably be supposed to have adopted this means of determining the true position of that 30th parallel on which they appear to have designed to place the great building they were about to erect. It so happens that we have the means of forming an opinion on the question whether they used one method or the other, whether they employed the sun or the stars to guide them to the geographical position they required. In fact, were it not for this circumstance, I should not have thought it worthwhile to discuss the qualities of either method. It will presently be seen that the discussion bears importantly on the opinion we are to form of the skill and attainments of the pyramid architects. Every celestial object is apparently raised somewhat above its true position by the refractive power of our atmosphere, being most raised when nearest the horizon and least when nearest the point vertically overhead. This effect is, indeed, so marked on bodies close to the horizon that if the astronomers of the pyramid times had observed the sun, moon, and stars attentively when so placed, they could not have failed to discover the peculiarity. Probably, however, though they noted the time of rising and setting of the celestial bodies, they only made instrumental observations upon them when these bodies were high in the heavens. Time equals, quote, 3,500 milliseconds, quote, / greater than. Thus they remained ignorant of the refractive powers of the air. Now, if they had determined the position of the 30th parallel of latitude by observations of the noonday sun in spring or autumn, then since, owing to refraction, they would have judged the sun to be higher than he really was, it follows that they would have supposed the latitude of any station from which they observed to be lower than it really was. For the lower the latitude, the higher is the noonday sun at any given season. Thus, when really in latitude some degrees, they would have supposed themselves in a latitude lower than some degrees, and would have traveled a little further north to find the proper place. As they would have supposed, time equals 1,200 milliseconds greater than for erecting the Great Pyramid. On the other hand, if they determined the place from observations of the movements of stars near the pole of the heavens, they would make an error of a precisely opposite nature. For the higher the latitude, the higher is the pole of the heavens, and refraction, therefore, which apparently raises the pole of the heavens, gives to a station the appearance of being in a higher latitude than it really is, so that the observer would consider he was in latitude some north, when in reality somewhat south of that latitude. We have only then to inquire whether the Great Pyramid was set north or south of latitude some degrees, to ascertain whether the pyramid architects observed the noonday sun or circumpolar stars to determine their latitude. Always assuming, as we reasonably may, that those architects did propose to set the pyramid in that particular latitude, and that they were able to make very accurate observations of the apparent positions of the celestial bodies, but that they were not acquainted with the refractive effects of the atmosphere. The answer comes in no doubtful terms. The center of the Great Pyramid's base lies about 1 mile and a third south of the 30th parallel of latitude, and from this position, the pole of the heavens, as raised by refraction, would appear to be very near indeed to the required position. In fact, if the pyramid had been set about half a mile still farther south, the pole would have seemed just right. Of course, such an explanation as I have here suggested appears altogether heretical to the pyramidalists. According to them, the pyramid architects knew perfectly well where the true 30th parallel lay, and knew also all that modern science has discovered about refraction, but set the pyramid south of the true parallel and north of the position where refraction would just have made the apparent elevation of the pole correct, simply in order that the pyramid might correspond as nearly as possible to each of two conditions, whereof both could not be fulfilled at once. The pyramids would indeed, they say, have been set even more closely midway between the true and the apparent parallels of some degrees north, but that the Giza hill on which it is set does not afford a rock foundation any farther north. So very close, says Professor Smith, was the Great Pyramid placed to the northern brink of its hill, that the edges of the cliff might have broken off under the terrible pressure had not the builders banked up there most firmly the immense mounds of rubbish which came from their work, and which Strabo looked so particularly for in the past years ago, but could not find. Here they were, however, and still are, utilized in enabling the Great Pyramid to stand on the very utmost verge of its commanding hill, within the limits of the two required latitudes, as well as over the center of the land's physical and radial formation, and at the same time on the sure and proverbially wise foundation of rock. The next circumstance to be noted in the position of the Great Pyramid, as of all the pyramids, is that the sides are carefully oriented. This, like the approximation to a particular latitude, must be regarded as an astronomical rather than a geographical relation. The accuracy with which the orientation has been effected will serve to show how far the builders had mastered the methods of astronomical observation by which orientation was to be secured. The problem was not so simple as might be supposed by those who are not acquainted with the way in which the cardinal points are correctly determined. By solar observations, or rather by the observations of shadows cast by vertical shafts before and after noon, the direction of the meridian. Time equals 1,200 milliseconds or north and south line can theoretically be ascertained. But probably in this case, as in determining the latitude, the builders took the stars for their guide. The pole of the heavens would mark the true north, and equally the pole star, when below or above the pole, would give the true north, but of course most conveniently when below the pole. Nor is it difficult to see how the builders would make use of the pole star for this purpose, from the middle of the northern side of the intended base, they would bore a slant passage tending always from the position of the pole star at its lower meridional passage. That star at each successive return to that position, serving to direct their progress, while its small range east and west of the pole would enable them most accurately to determine the star's true midpoint below the pole, that is, the true north. When they had thus obtained a slant tunnel pointing truly to the meridian, and had carried it down to a point nearly below the middle of the proposed square base, they could, from the middle of the base, bore vertically downwards until by rough calculation they were near the lower end of the slant tunnel. Or both tunnels could be made at the same time. Then a subterranean chamber would be opened out from the slant tunnel. The vertical boring, which need not be wider than necessary to allow a plumb line to be suspended down it, would enable the architects to determine the point vertically below the point of suspension. The slant tunnel would give the direction of the true north, either from that point or from a point at some known small distance east or west of that point. Thus, a line from some ascertained point near the mouth of the vertical, boring to the mouth of the slant tunnel, would lie due north and south and serve as the required guide for the orientation of the pyramid's base. If this base extended beyond the opening of the slant tunnel, then, by continuing this tunneling through the base tiers of the pyramid, the means would be obtained of correcting the orientation. This, I say, would be the course naturally suggested to astronomical architects who had determined the latitude in the manner described above. It may even be described as the only very accurate method available before the telescope had been invented, so that if the accuracy of the orientation appears to be greater than could be obtained by the shadow method, the natural inference, even in the absence of corroborative evidence, would be that the stellar method and no other had been employed. Now, in sum, Nuet, by refined observations, found the error of orientation measured by less than some minutes of arc, corresponding roughly to a displacement of the corners by about some inches from their true position, as supposed to be determined from the center, or to a displacement of a southern corner by some inches on an east and west line from a point due south of the corresponding northern corner. This error, for a base length of some inches, would not be serious, being only 1 inch in about 5 yards, when estimated in the second way. Yet the result is not quite worthy of the praise given to it by Professor Smith. He himself, however, by much more exact observations, with an excellent altazimuth, reduced the alleged error from some minutes to only some, or to some 40ths of its formerly supposed value. This made the total displacement of a southern corner from the true meridian through the corresponding northern corner almost exactly 1 foot or 1 inch in about 21 yards, a degree of accuracy rendering it practically certain that some stellar method was used in orienting the base. Now there's a slanting tunnel, occupying precisely the position of the tunnel, which should, according to this view, have been formed in order accurately to orient the pyramid's base, assuming that the time of the building of the pyramid corresponded with one of the epochs when the star Alpha Draconis was distant some degrees from the pole of the heavens. In other words, there is a slant tunnel directed northwards and upwards from a point deep down below the middle of the pyramid's base and inclined some degrees, some to the horizon, the elevation of Alpha Draconis at its lower culmination, when some degrees, some from the pole. The last epoch when the star was thus placed was circa some BC. The epoch next before that was some BC. Between these two, we should have to choose, on the hypothesis that the slant tunnel was really directed to that star when the foundations of the pyramid were laid. For the next epoch before the earlier of the two named was about some BC, and the pyramid's date cannot have been more remote than some BC. The slant tunnel, while admirably fulfilling the requirements suggested, seems altogether unsuited for any other. Its transverse height, that is, its width in a direction perpendicular to its upper and lower faces, did not amount to quite 4 feet. Its breadth was not quite 3 feet and a half. It was, therefore, not well fitted for an entrance passage to the subterranean chamber immediately under the apex of the pyramid, with which chamber it communicates in the manner suggested by the above theory. It could not have been intended to be used for observing meridian transits of the stars in order to determine sidereal time. For close circumpolar stars, by reason of their slow motion, are the least suited of all for such a purpose. As Professor Smythe says, in arguing against this suggested use of the star, no observer in his senses, in any existing observatory, when seeking to obtain the time, would observe the transit of a circumpolar star for anything else than to get the direction of the meridian to adjust his instrument by. The italics are his. It is precisely such a purpose, the adjustment, however, not of an instrument, but of the entire structure of the pyramid itself, that I have suggested for this remarkable passage, this cream-white, stone-lined long tube, where it traverses the masonry of the pyramid, and below that, dug through the solid rock to a distance of more than some feet. Let us next consider the dimensions of the square base, thus carefully placed in latitude some degrees north to the best of the builder's power, with sides carefully oriented. It seems highly probable that whatever special purpose the pyramid was intended to fulfill, a subordinate idea of the builders would have been to represent symbolically in the proportions of the building such mathematical and astronomical relations as they were acquainted with. From what we know by tradition of the men of the remote time when the pyramid was built, and what we can infer from the ideas of those who inherited, however remotely, the modes of thought of the earliest astronomers and mathematicians, we can well believe that they would look with superstitious reverence on special figures, proportions, numbers. Time equals 1,200 milliseconds, / greater than, and so forth. Apart from this, they may have had a quasi-scientific desire to make a lasting record of their discoveries and of the collected knowledge of their time. It seems altogether probable, then, that the smaller unit of measurement used by the builders of the Great Pyramid was intended, as Professor Smith thinks, to be equal to the some congenital part of the Earth's diameter, determined from their geodetical observations. It was perfectly within the power of mechanicians and mathematicians so experienced as they undoubtedly were, the pyramid attests so much, to measure with considerable accuracy the length of a degree of latitude. They could not possibly, always setting aside the theory of divine inspiration, have known anything about the compression of the Earth's globe, and therefore could not have intended, as Professor Smith supposes, to have had the some 0.000th part of the Earth's polar axis, as distinguished from any other, for their unit of length. But if they made observations in or near latitude some degrees north, on the supposition that the Earth is a globe, their probable error would exceed the difference even between the Earth's polar and equatorial diameters. Both differences are largely exceeded by the range of difference among the estimates of the actual length of the sacred cubit, supposed to have contained 25 of these smaller units. And, again, the length of the pyramid base side, on which Smythe bases his own estimate of the sacred cubit, has been variously estimated, the largest measure being some inches and the lowest some inches. The fundamental theory of the pyramidalists that the sacred cubit was exactly one some-th part of the Earth's polar diameter, and that the side of the base contained as many cubits and parts of a cubit as there are days and parts of a day in the tropical year or year of seasons, requires that the length of the side should be some inches, lying between the limits indicated, but still so widely removed from either that it would appear very unsafe to base a theory on the supposition that the exact length is or was some inches. If the measures some inches and some inches were inferior, and several excellent measures made by practiced observers ranged around the length some inches, the case would be different. But the best recent measures gave respectively some and some inches. And Smythe exclaims against the unfairness of Sir H. James in taking some as therefore the probable true length of the side of the Great Pyramid when perfect, calling this a dishonorable shelving of the honorable older observers with their larger results. The only other measures besides these two are two by Colonel Howard Vyse and by the French savants, giving respectively some and some inches. The pyramidalists consider some inches a fair mean value from these four. The natural inference, however, is that the pyramid base is not now in a condition to be satisfactorily measured, and assuredly no such reliance can be placed on the mean value some inches that on the strength of it we should believe what otherwise would be utterly incredible, viz., that the builders of the Great Pyramid knew both the size and shape of the earth exactly. Humanly, or by human science, finding it out in that age was, of course, utterly impossible, says Professor Smith. But he is so confident of the average value derived from widely conflicting base measures as to assume that this value, not being humanly discoverable, was of necessity attributable to God and to his divine inspiration. We may agree, in fine, with Smith that the builders of the pyramid knew the earth to be a globe, that they took for their measure of length the sacred cubit, which by their earth measures they made very fairly approximate to the some 0.000 the part of the earth's mean diameter. But there seems no reason whatever for supposing, even if the supposition were not antecedently of its very nature inadmissible, that they knew anything about the compression of the earth, or that they had measured a degree of latitude in their own place with very wonderful accuracy. Time equals, quote, 3,500 milliseconds, quote, / greater than. But here a very singular coincidence may be noticed, or rather is forced upon our notice by the pyramidalists, who strangely enough recognize in it fresh evidence of design, while the unbeliever finds in it proof that coincidences are no sure evidence of design. The side of the pyramid containing sometimes the sacred cubit of some pyramid inches, it follows that the diagonal of the base contains some such inches, and the two diagonals together contain some pyramid inches, or almost exactly as many inches as there are years in the great precessional period. No one whatever amongst men, says Professor Smith, after recording various estimates of the precessional period from his own or school knowledge, knew anything about such a phenomenon until Hipparchus, some in the past years after the Great Pyramid's foundation, had a glimpse of the fact. And yet it had been ruling the heavens for ages and was recorded in Jesus' ancient structure. To minds not moved to most energetic forgetfulness by the spirit of faith, it would appear that when a square base had been decided upon and its dimensions fixed, with reference to the Earth's diameter and the year, the diagonals of the square base were determined also, and if it so chanced that they corresponded with some other perfectly independent relation, the fact was not to be credited to the architects. Moreover, it is manifest that the closeness of such a coincidence suggests grave doubts how far other coincidences can be relied upon as evidence of design. It seems, for instance, altogether likely that the architects of the pyramid took the sacred cubit equal to one sum 0 0 0 0 0 0 0 0 0 0 0 0 0 0 0 0 0 0 0 0 0 0 0 0 0 0 0 0 0 0 0 0 0 0 0 days in the year, and the closeness of the coincidence between the measured length and that indicated by this theory strengthens the idea that this was the builder's purpose. But when we find that an even closer coincidence immediately presents itself, which manifestly is a coincidence, only the force of the evidence before derived from mere coincidence is pro tanto shaken. For consider what this new coincidence really means. Its nature may be thus indicated. Take the number of days in the year, multiply that number by some, and increase the result in the same degree that the diagonal of a square exceeds the side. Then the resulting number represents very approximately the number of years in the great precessional period. The error, according to the best modern estimates, is about 1/575th part of the true period. This is, of course, a merely accidental coincidence, for there is no connection whatever in nature between the Earth's period of rotation, the shape of a square, and the Earth's period of gyration. Yet this merely accidental coincidence is very much closer than the other supposed to be designed could be proved to be. It is clear, then, that mere coincidence is a very unsafe evidence of design. Of course, the pyramidalists find a ready reply to such reasoning. They argue that, in the first place, it may have been by express design that the period of the Earth's rotation was made to bear this particular relation to the period of gyration in the mighty precessional movement, which is much as though one should say that by express design the height of Monte Rosa contains as many feet as there are miles in the 6,000th part of the sun's distance. Then they urge time equals 1,200 milliseconds. The architects were not bound to have a square base for the pyramid. They might have had an oblong or a triangular base, and so forth, all which accords very ill with the enthusiastic language in which the selection of a square base had on other accounts been applauded. Next, let us consider the height of the pyramid. According to the best modern measurements, it would seem that the height, when, if ever, the pyramid terminated above in a pointed apex, must have been about some feet. And from the comparison of the best estimates of the base side with the best estimates of the height, it seems very likely indeed that the intention of the builders was to make the height bear to the perimeter of the base the same ratio which the radius of a circle bears to the circumference. Remembering the range of difference in the base measures, it might be supposed that the exactness of the approximation to this ratio could not be determined very satisfactorily. But as certain casing stones have been discovered, which indicate with considerable exactness the slope of the original plane surfaces of the pyramid, the ratio of the height to the side of the base may be regarded as much more satisfactorily determined than the actual value of either dimension. Of course, the pyramidalists claim a degree of precision, indicating a most accurate knowledge of the ratio between the diameter and the circumference of a circle, and the angle of the only casing stone measured being diversely estimated at some degrees some, and some degrees some, some. They consider some degrees some, the true value, and infer that the builders regarded the ratio as some to some. The real fact is that the modern estimates of the dimensions of the casing stones, which, by the way, ought to agree better if these stones are as well made as stated, indicate the values some, and some sum for the ratio. And all we can say is that the ratio really used lay probably between these limits, though it may have been outside either. Now, the approximation of either is not remarkably close. It requires no mathematical knowledge at all to determine the circumference of a circle much more exactly. "I thought it very strange," wrote a circle squarer once to De Morgan, Budget of Paradoxes Sum, "that so many great scholars in all ages should have failed in finding the true ratio, and have been determined to try myself. I have been informed," proceeds De Morgan, "that this trial makes the diameter to the circumference as sum to sum, giving the ratio equal to sum times sum exactly. The result was obtained by the discoverer in 3 weeks after he first heard of the existence of the difficulty. This quadrator has since published a little slip and entered it at Stationers' Hall. He says he has done it by actual measurement, and I hear from a private source that he uses a disc of 12 inches diameter, which he rolls upon a straight rail. The rolling is a very creditable one. It is as much below the mark as Archimedes was above it. Its performer is a joiner who evidently knows well what he is about when he measures. He is not wrong by some in sum. Such skillful mechanicians as the builders of the pyramid could have obtained a closer approximation still by mere measurement. Besides, as they were manifestly mathematicians, such an approximation as was obtained by Archimedes must have been well within their power, and that approximation lies well within the limits above indicated. Professor Smith remarks that the ratio was a quantity which men in general, and all human science too, did not begin to trouble themselves about until long, long ages, languages, and nations had passed away after the building of the Great Pyramid, and after the sealing up, too, of that grand primeval and prehistoric monument of the patriarchal age of the earth according to Scripture. I do not know where the Scripture records the sealing up of the Great Pyramid, but it is all but certain that during the very time when the pyramid was being built, astronomical observations were in progress which, for their interpretation, involved of necessity a continual reference to the ratio in question. No one who considers the wonderful accuracy with which, nearly 2,000 years before the Christian era, the Chaldeans had determined the famous cycle of the Saros, can doubt that they must have observed the heavenly bodies for several centuries before they could have achieved such a success. And the study of the motions of the celestial bodies compels men to trouble themselves about the famous ratio of the circumference to the diameter. We now come upon a new relation, contained in the dimensions of the pyramid as thus determined, which, by a strange coincidence, causes the height of the pyramid to appear to symbolize the distance of the sun. There were some pyramid inches, or some British inches, in the height of the pyramid according to the relations already indicated. Now, in the sun's distance, according to an estimate recently adopted and freely used, there are some miles or some 1,000 millions of inches. That is, there are approximately as many 1,000 millions of inches in the sun's distance as there are inches in the height of the pyramid. If we take the relation as exact, we should infer for the sun's distance some 1,000 millions of inches, or some miles, an immense improvement on the estimate which for so many years occupied a place of honor in our books of astronomy. Besides, there is strong reason for believing that when the results of recent observations are worked out, the estimated sun distance will be much nearer this pyramid value than even to the value some recently adopted. This result, which one would have thought so damaging to faith in the evidence from coincidence, nay, quite fatal after the other case in which a close coincidence had appeared by merest accident, is regarded by the pyramidalist as a perfect triumph for their faith. They connect it with another coincidence, viz. that, assuming the height determined in the way already indicated, then it so happens that the height bears to half a diagonal of the base the ratio sum to sum. Seeing that the perimeter of the base symbolizes the annual motion of the Earth round the Sun, while the height represents the radius of a circle with that perimeter, it follows that the height should symbolize the Sun's distance. That line further, says Professor Smeath, speaking on behalf of Mr. W. Petrie, the discoverer of this relation, must represent this radius in the proportion of sum to sum, or 10 raised to power 9, because amongst other reasons, sum to sum is practically the shape of the Great Pyramid. For this building has such an angle at the corners that for every 10 units its structure advances inwards on the diagonal of the base. It practically rises upwards or points to sunshine. By 9. 9 too, out of the 10 characteristic parts, viz. 5 angles and 5 sides, being the number of those parts which the sun shines on in such a shaped pyramid, in such a latitude near the equator out of a high sky, or, as the Peruvians say, when the sun sets, on the pyramid with all its rays. The coincidence itself on which this perverse reasoning rests is a singular one. Singular, that is, as showing how close an accidental coincidence may run. It amounts to this, that if the number of days in the year be multiplied by some, and a circle be drawn with a circumference containing sometimes as many inches as there are days in the year, the radius of the circle will be very nearly one sum, 0, the part of the sun's distance. Remembering that the pyramid inch is assumed to be one sum, 0, the part of the Earth's diameter, we shall not be far from the truth in saying that, as a matter of fact, time equals 1,200 milliseconds. The Earth, by her orbital motion, traverses each day a distance equal to 200 times her own diameter. But of course, this relation is altogether accidental. It has no real cause in nature. Such relations show that mere numerical coincidences, however close, have little weight as evidence, except where they occur in series. Even then, they require to be very cautiously regarded, seeing that the history of science records many instances where the apparent law of a series has been found to be falsified when the theory has been extended. Of course, this reason is not quoted in order to throw doubt on the supposition that the height of the pyramid was intended to symbolize the sun's distance. That supposition is simply inadmissible if the hypothesis, according to which the height was already independently determined in another way, is admitted. Either hypothesis might be admitted were we not certain that the sun's distance could not possibly have been known to the builders of the pyramid, or both hypotheses may be rejected, but to admit both is out of the question. Considering the multitude of dimensions of length, surface, capacity, and position, the great number of shapes, and the variety of material existing within the pyramid, and considering further the enormous number of relations presented by modern science, from among which to choose, can it be wondered at if fresh coincidences are being continually recognized? If a dimension will not serve in one way, use can be found for it in another. For instance, if some measure of length does not correspond closely with any known dimension of the Earth or of the solar system, an unlikely supposition, then it can be understood to typify an interval of time. If even after trying all possible changes of that kind, no coincidence shows itself, which is all but impossible, then all that is needed to secure a coincidence is that the dimensions should be manipulated a little. Let a single instance suffice to show how the pyramidalists, with perfect honesty of purpose, hunt down a coincidence. The slant tunnel already described has a transverse height, once no doubt uniform, now giving various measures from some pyramid inches to some inches, so that the vertical height from the known inclination of the tunnel would be estimated at somewhere between some inches and some. Neither dimension corresponds very obviously with any measured distance in the Earth or solar system. Nor when we try periods, areas, etc., does any very satisfactory coincidence present itself. But the difficulty is easily turned into a new proof of design. Putting all the observations together, says Professor Smith, I deduced some pyramid inches to be the transverse height of the entrance passage, and computing from thence, with the observed angle of inclination, the vertical height, that came out some of the same inches. But the sum of those two heights, or the height taken up and down, equals some inches, which length, as elsewhere shown, is the general pyramid linear representation of a day of 24 hours, and the mean of the two heights, or the height taken one way only and impartially to the middle point between them, equals 50 inches, which quantity is therefore the general pyramid linear representation of only half a day. In which case, let us ask what the entrance passage has to do with half rather than a whole day. On relations such as these, which time equals 1,200 milliseconds / greater than if really intended by the architect, would imply an utterly fatuous habit of concealing elaborately what he desired to symbolize. The pyramidalists based their belief that a mighty intelligence did both think out the plans for it and compel unwilling and ignorant idolaters in a primal age of the world to work mightily both for the future glory of the one true God of revelation, and to establish lasting prophetic testimony touching a further development still to take place of the absolutely divine Christian dispensation. In this next quiet passage, the mystery of the pyramids, few subjects of inquiry have proved more perplexing than the question of the purpose for which the pyramids of Egypt were built. Time equals, quote, 3,500 milliseconds. Quote, / even in the remotest ages of which we have historical record, nothing seems to have been known, certainly on this point. For some reason or other, the builders of the pyramids concealed the object of these structures, and this so successfully that not even a tradition has reached us which purports to have been handed down from the epoch of the pyramid's construction. We find indeed some explanations given by the earliest historians, but they were professedly only hypothetical, like those advanced in more recent times. Including ancient and modern theories, we find a wide range of choice. Some have thought that these buildings were associated with the religion of the early Egyptians. Others have suggested that they were tombs. Others, that they combined the purposes of tombs and temples, that they were astronomical observatories, defenses against the sands of the great desert, granaries like those made under Joseph's direction, places of resort during excessive overflows of the Nile, and many other uses have been suggested for them. But none of these ideas are found on close examination to be tenable as representing the sole purpose of the pyramids, and few of them have strong claims to be regarded as presenting even a chief object of these remarkable structures. The significant and perplexing history of the three oldest pyramids, the Great Pyramid of Cheops, Shofo, or Sufis, the Pyramid of Chephren, and the Pyramid of Mesmerinus, and the most remarkable of all the facts known respecting the pyramids generally, viz., the circumstance that one pyramid after another was built as though each had become useless soon after it was finished, are left entirely unexplained by all the theories above mentioned, save one only, the tomb theory, and that does not afford by any means a satisfactory explanation of the circumstances. I propose to give here a brief account of some of the most suggestive facts known respecting the pyramids, and, after considering the difficulties which beset the theories heretofore advanced, to indicate a theory new, so far as I know, which seems to me to correspond better with the facts than any heretofore advanced. I suggest it, however, rather for consideration than because I regard it as very convincingly supported by the evidence. In fact, to advance any theory at present with confident assurance of its correctness would be simply to indicate a very limited acquaintance with the difficulties surrounding the subject. Let us first consider a few of the more striking facts recorded by history or tradition, noting, as we proceed, whatever ideas they may suggest as to the intended character of these structures. It is hardly necessary to say, perhaps, that the history of the Great Pyramid is of paramount importance in this inquiry. Whatever purpose pyramids were originally intended to subserve must have been conceived by the builders of that pyramid. New ideas may have been superadded by the builders of later pyramids, but it is unlikely that the original purpose can have been entirely abandoned. Some great purpose there was, which the rulers of ancient Egypt proposed to fulfill by building very massive pyramidal structures on a particular plan. It is by inquiring into the history of the first and most massive of these structures, and by examining its construction, that we shall have the best chance of finding out what that great purpose was. According to Herodotus, the kings who built the pyramids reigned not more than 28 centuries ago. But there can be little doubt that Herodotus misunderstood the Egyptian priests from whom he derived his information, and that the real antiquity of the pyramid kings was far greater. He tells us that, according to the Egyptian priests, Cheops, on ascending the throne, plunged into all manner of wickedness. He closed the temples and forbade the Egyptians to offer sacrifice, compelling them instead to labor one and all in his service, viz., in building the Great Pyramid. Still following his interpretation of the Egyptian account, we learn that 100,000 men were employed for 20 years in building the Great Pyramid, and that 10 years were occupied in constructing a causeway by which to convey the stones to the place and in conveying them there. Cheops reigned 50 years and was succeeded by his brother Chephren, who imitated the conduct of his predecessor, built a pyramid, but smaller than his brothers, and reigned 56 years. Thus, during 106 years, the temples were shut and never opened. Moreover, Herodotus tells us that the Egyptians so detested the memory of these kings that they do not much like even to mention their names. Hence, they commonly call the pyramids after Felician, a shepherd, who at that time fed his flocks about the place. After Chephren, Mesmerizing, son of Cheops, ascended the throne. He reopened the temples and allowed the people to resume the practice of sacrifice. He too left a pyramid, but much inferior in size to his father's. It is built for half of its height of the stone of Ethiopia, or, as Professor Smith, whose extracts from Rawlinson's translation I have here followed, adds expensive red granite. After Mykerinus, Asychis ascended the throne. He built the eastern gateway of the temple of Vulcan, Pitha, and, being desirous of eclipsing all his predecessors on the throne, left as a monument of his reign a pyramid of brick. This account is so suggestive, as will presently be shown, that it may be well to inquire whether it can be relied on. Now, although there can be no doubt that Herodotus misunderstood the Egyptians in some matters, and in particular as to the chronological order of the dynasties, placing the Pyramid Kings far too late, yet in other respects he seems not only to have understood them correctly, but also to have received a correct account from them. The order of the kings above named corresponds with the sequence given by Manetho, and also found in monumental and hieroglyphic records. Manetho gives the names Suphis the first, Suphis the second, and Mencheres instead of Cheops, Chephren. Time equals 1,200 milliseconds greater than, and Mykerinus, while according to the modern Egyptologists, Herodotus's Cheops was Shofo, Shufu, or Khufu. Chephren was Shafre, while he was also called Nu Shofo, or Num Shufu, as the brother of Shofo. And Mesmerinus was Menhir, or Menkare. But the identity of these kings is not questioned. As to the true dates, there is much doubt, and it is probable that the question will long continue open. But the determination of the exact epochs when the several pyramids were built is not very important in connection with our present inquiry. We may, on the whole, fairly take the points quoted above from Herodotus and proceed to place. It is manifest that Cheops, to call him Cheops, was a great king of Egypt. In the second place, it is manifest that Cheops, to call the first king by the name most familiar to the general reader, attached great importance to the building of his pyramid. It has been said, and perhaps justly, that it will be more interesting to know the plan of the architect who devised the pyramid than the purpose of the king who built it. But the two things are closely connected. The architect must have satisfied the king that some highly important purpose in which the king himself was interested would be subserved by the structure. Whether the king was persuaded to undertake the work as a matter of duty or only to advance his own interests may not be so clear. But that the king was most thoroughly in earnest about the work is certain. A monarch in those times would assuredly not have devoted an enormous amount of labor and material to such a scheme unless he was thoroughly convinced of its great importance. That the welfare of his people was not considered by Cheops in building the Great Pyramid is almost equally certain. He might, indeed, have had a scheme for their good which either he did not care to explain to them or which they could not understand. But the most natural inference from the narrative is that his purpose had no reference whatever to their welfare. For though one could understand his own subjects hating him while he was all the time working for their good, it is obvious that his memory would not have been hated if some important good had eventually been gained from his scheme. Many a far-seeing ruler has been hated while living on account of the very work for which his memory has been revered. But the memory of Cheops and his successors was held in detestation. May we, however, suppose that though Cheops had not the welfare of his own people in his thoughts, his purpose was nevertheless not selfish, but intended in some way to promote the welfare of the human race. I say his purpose because whoever originated the scheme, Cheops carried it out. It was by means of his wealth and through his power that the pyramid was built. This is the view adopted by Professor Piazzi Smith and others in our own time, and first suggested by John Taylor. Whereas other writers, says Smith, have generally esteemed that the mysterious persons who directed the building of the Great Pyramid, and to whom the Egyptians, in their traditions and for ages afterwards, gave an immoral and even abominable character, must therefore have been very bad indeed, so that the world at large has always been fond of standing on, kicking, and insulting that dead lion, whom they really knew not. He, Mr. John Taylor, seeing how religiously bad the Egyptians themselves were, was led to conclude, on the contrary, that those they hated and could never sufficiently abuse might, perhaps, have been preeminently good, or were, at all events, of different religious faith from themselves. Combining this with certain unmistakable historical facts, Mr. Taylor deduced reasons for believing that the directors of the building designed to record in its proportions and in its interior features certain important religious and scientific truths, not for the people then living, but for men who were to come some years or so after. I have already considered at length, see the preceding essay, the evidence on which this strange theory rests. But there are certain matters connecting it with the above narrative which must here be noticed. The mention of the shepherd Felician, who fed his flocks about the place where the Great Pyramid was built, is a singular feature of Herodotus's narrative. It reads like some strange misinterpretation of the story related to him by the Egyptian priests. It is obvious that if the word Felician did not represent a people, but a person, this person must have been very eminent and distinguished, a shepherd king, not a mere shepherd. Rawlinson, in a note on this portion of the narrative of Herodotus, suggests that Philetus was probably a shepherd prince from Palestine, perhaps of Philistine descent, but so powerful and domineering that it may be traditions of his oppressions in that earlier age which mixed up afterwards in the minds of later Egyptians with the evils inflicted on their country by the subsequent shepherds of better-known dynasties, lent so much reverence to their religious hate of shepherd times and that name. Smith, Somewhat modifying this view and considering certain remarks of Manetho respecting an alleged invasion of Egypt by shepherd kings, men of an ignoble race from the Egyptian point of view, who had the confidence to invade our country and easily subdued it to their power without a battle, comes to the conclusion that some Shemite prince, a contemporary of, but rather older than, the patriarch Abraham, visited Egypt at this time and obtained such influence over the mind of Cheops as to persuade him to erect the pyramid. According to Smythe, the prince was no other than Melchizedek, king of Salem, and the influence he exerted was supernatural. With such developments of the theory, we need not trouble ourselves. It seems tolerably clear that certain shepherd chiefs who came to Egypt during Cheops's reign were connected in some way with the designing of the Great Pyramid. It is clear also that they were men of a different religion from the Egyptians and persuaded Cheops to abandon the religion of his people. Taylor, Smith, and the pyramidalists generally consider this sufficient to prove that the pyramid was erected for some purpose connected with religion. The pyramid, in fine, says Smythe, was charged by God's inspired shepherd prince in the beginning of human time to keep a certain message secret and inviolable for some years, and it has done so. And in the next 1,000 years, it was to enunciate that message to all men with more than traditional force, more than all the authenticity of copied manuscripts or reputed history. And that part of the pyramid's usefulness is now beginning. There are many very obvious difficulties surrounding this theory, as time equals 1,200 milliseconds / greater than, for example, 1, the absurd waste of power in setting supernatural machinery at work some years ago with cumbrous devices to record its object, when the same machinery, much more simply employed now, would effect the alleged purpose far more thoroughly. 2. The enormous amount of human misery and its attendant hatreds brought about by this alleged divine scheme. And 3. The futility of an arrangement by which the pyramid was only to subserve its purpose when it had lost that perfection of shape on which its entire significance depended according to the theory itself. But apart from these, there is a difficulty nowhere noticed by Smythe or his followers, which is fatal, I conceive, to this theory of the pyramid's purpose. The second pyramid, though slightly inferior to the first in size, and probably far inferior in quality of masonry, is still a structure of enormous dimensions, which must have required many years of labor from tens of thousands of workmen. Now, it seems impossible to explain why Chephren built this second pyramid, if we adopt Smith's theory respecting the first pyramid. For either Chephren knew the purpose for which the Great Pyramid was built, or he did not know it. If he knew that purpose, and it was that indicated by Smythe, then he also knew that no second pyramid was wanted. Time equals 3,500 milliseconds greater than. On that hypothesis, all the labor bestowed on the second pyramid was wittingly and willfully wasted. This, of course, is incredible. But on the other hand, if Chephren did not know what was the purpose for which the Great Pyramid was built, what reason could Chephren have had for building a pyramid at all? The only answer to this question seems to be that Chephren built the second pyramid in hopes of finding out why his brother had built the first, and this answer is simply absurd. It is clear enough that whatever purpose Cheops had in building the first pyramid, Chephren must have had a similar purpose in building the second, and we require a theory which shall at least explain why the first pyramid did not subserve for Chephren the purpose which it subserved or was meant to subserve for Cheops. The same reasoning may be extended to the third pyramid, to the fourth, and in fine to all the pyramids, 40 or so in number, included under the general designation of the pyramids of Gizeh or Giza. The extension of the principle to pyramids later than the second is especially important as showing that the difference of religion insisted on by Smythe has no direct bearing on the question of the purpose for which the Great Pyramid itself was constructed. For Mykerinus either never left or else returned to the religion of the Egyptians. Yet he also built a pyramid, which, though far inferior in size to the pyramids built by his father and uncle, was still a massive structure and relatively more costly even than theirs because built of expensive granite. The pyramid built by Asychis, though smaller still, was remarkable as built of brick. In fact, we are expressly told that Asychis desired to eclipse all his predecessors in such labors, and accordingly left this brick pyramid as a monument of his reign. We are forced, in fact, to believe that there was some special relation between the pyramid and its builder, seeing that each one of these kings wanted a pyramid of his own. This applies to the Great Pyramid quite as much as to the others, despite the superior excellence of that structure. Or rather, time equals 1,200 milliseconds. The argument derives its chief force from the superiority of the Great Pyramid. If Chephren, no longer perhaps having the assistance of the shepherd architects in planning and superintending the work, was unable to construct a pyramid so perfect and so stately as his brothers, the very fact that he nevertheless built a pyramid shows that the Great Pyramid did not fulfill for Chephren the purpose which it fulfilled for Cheops. But if Smith's theory were true, the Great Pyramid would have fulfilled finally, and for all men, the purpose for which it was built. Since this was manifestly not the case, that theory is, I submit, demonstrably erroneous. It was probably the consideration of this point. Time equals 1,200 milliseconds / greater than viz. That each king had a pyramid constructed for himself, which led to the theory that the pyramids were intended to serve as tombs. This theory was once very generally entertained. Thus we find Humboldt, in his remarks on American pyramids, referring to the tomb theory of the Egyptian pyramids as though it were open to no question. When we consider, he says, the pyramidical monuments of Egypt, of Asia, and of the New Continent, from the same point of view, we see that, though their form is alike, their destination was altogether different. The group of pyramids of Gizeh and at Saqqara in Egypt, the triangular pyramid of the Queen of the Scythians, Serene, which was a stadium high and 3 in circumference, and which was decorated with a colossal figure. The 14 Etruscan pyramids, which are said to have been enclosed in the labyrinth of the king Porsena at Clusium, were reared to serve as the sepulchres of the illustrious dead. Nothing is more natural to men than to commemorate the spot where rest the ashes of those whose memory they cherish, whether it be, as in the infancy of the race, by simple mounds of earth, or, in later periods, by the towering height of the tumulus. Those of the Chinese and of Tibet have only a few meters of elevation. Farther to the west, the dimensions increase. The tumulus of the king Alyattes, father of Croesus, in Lydia, was 6 stadia, and that of Ninus was more than 10 stadia in diameter. In the north of Europe, the sepulchre of the Scandinavian king Gormus and the queen Danaboda, covered with mounds of earth, are 300 meters broad and more than 30 high. But while we have abundant reason for believing that in Egypt, even in the days of Cheops and Chephren, extreme importance was attached to the character of the place of burial for distinguished persons, there is nothing in what is known respecting earlier Egyptian ideas to suggest the probability that any monarch would have devoted many years of his subjects' labor and vast stores of material to erect a mass of masonry like the Great Pyramid, solely to receive his own body after death. Far less have we any reason for supposing that many monarchs in succession would do this, each having a separate tomb built for him. It might have been conceivable, had only the Great Pyramid been erected, that the structure had been raised as a mausoleum for all the kings and princes of the dynasty. But it seems utterly incredible that such a building as the Great Pyramid should have been erected for one king's body only, and that not in the way described by Humboldt, when he speaks of men commemorating the spot where rest the remains of those whose memory they cherish, but at the expense of the king himself, whose body was to be there deposited. Besides, the first pyramid, the one whose history must be regarded as most significant of the true purpose of these buildings, was not built by an Egyptian holding in great favor the special religious ideas of his people, but by one who had adopted other views and those not belonging, so far as can be seen, to a people among whom sepulchral rites were held in exceptional regard. A still stronger objection against the exclusively tombic theory resides in the fact that this theory gives no account whatever of the characteristic features of the pyramids themselves. These buildings are all, without exception, built on special astronomical principles. Their square bases are so placed as to have 2 sides lying east and west, and 2 lying north and south, or, in other words, so that their 4 faces front the 4 cardinal points. One can imagine no reason why a tomb should have such a position. It is not indeed easy to understand why any building at all, except an astronomical observatory, should have such a position. A temple perhaps devoted to sun worship, and generally to the worship of the heavenly bodies, might be built in that way. For it is to be noticed that the peculiar figure and position of the pyramids would bring about the following relations. When the sun rose and set south of the east and west points, time equals 1,200 milliseconds, or, speaking generally, between the autumn and the spring equinoxes, the rays of the rising and setting sun illuminated the southern face of the pyramid, whereas during the rest of the year, that is, during the 6 months between the spring and autumn equinoxes, the rays of the rising and setting sun illuminated the northern face. Again, all the year round, the sun's rays passed from the eastern to the western face at solar noon. And lastly, during 7 months and a half of each year, namely for 3 months and 3 quarters, before and after midsummer, the noon rays of the sun fell on all 4 faces of the pyramid. or, according to a Peruvian expression, so Smith avers, the sun shone on the pyramid with all his rays. Such conditions as these might have been regarded as very suitable for a temple devoted to sun worship. Yet the temple theory is as untenable as the tomb theory. For in the first place, the pyramid form, as the pyramids were originally built with perfectly smooth, slant faces, not terraced into steps as now through the loss of the casing stones, was entirely unsuited for all the ordinary requirements of a temple of worship. And further, this theory gives no explanation of the fact that each king built a pyramid, and each king only one. Similar difficulties oppose the theory that the pyramids were intended to serve as astronomical observatories. For while their original figure, however manifestly astronomical in its relations, was quite unsuited for observatory work, it is manifest that if such had been the purpose of pyramid building, so soon as the Great Pyramid had once been built, no other would be needed. Certainly, none of the pyramids built afterwards could have subserved any astronomical purpose which the first did not subserve, or have subserved nearly so well as the Great Pyramid those purposes, and they are but few, which that building may be supposed to have fulfilled as an astronomical observatory. Of the other theories mentioned at the beginning of this paper, none seem to merit special notice, except perhaps the theory that the pyramids were made to receive the royal treasures, and this theory rather because of the attention it received from Arabian literati during the 9th and 10th centuries, than because of any strong reasons which can be suggested in its favor. Emulating, says Professor Smith, the enchanted tales of Baghdad, the court poets of Al-Mamun, son of the far-famed Harun al-Rashid, drew gorgeous pictures of the contents of the pyramid's interior. All the treasures of Sheddad ben Ad, the great antediluvian king of the earth, with all his medicines and all his sciences, they declared were there, told over and over again. Others, though, were positive that the founder king was no other than Saurid ibn Salhuk, a far greater one than the other. And these last gave many more minute particulars, some of which are at least interesting to us in the present day, as proving that amongst the Egypto-Arabians of more than 1,000 years ago, the Giza pyramids, headed by the Grand One, enjoyed a preeminence of fame vastly before all the other pyramids of Egypt put together, and that if any other is alluded to after the Great Pyramid, which has always been the notable and favorite one, and chiefly was known then as the East Pyramid. It is either the second one at Giza, under the name of the West Pyramid, or the third one, distinguished as the Colored Pyramid, in allusion to its red granite compared with the white limestone casings of the other two, which moreover, from their more near, but by no means exact equality of size, went frequently under the affectionate designation of the pair. The reporter of Ibn Abd al-Qom as to what was to be found in each of these three pyramids, or rather of what, according to him, was put into them originally by King Saurid, runs as follows. In the Western Pyramid, 30 treasuries filled with store of riches and utensils, and with signatures made of precious stones, and with instruments of iron, and vessels of earth, and with arms which rust not, and with glass which might be bended and yet not broken, and with strange spells, and with several kinds of alacakirs, magical precious stones, single and double, and with deadly poisons, and with other things besides. He made also in the east the Great Pyramid, divers celestial spheres and stars, and what they severally operate in their aspects, and the perfumes which are to be used to them, and the books which treat of these matters. He put also into the colored pyramid the commentaries of the priest in chests of black marble, and with every priest a book, in which the wonders of his profession, and of his actions and of his nature were written, and what was done in his time, and what is, and what shall be from the beginning of time to the end of it. The rest of this worthy's report relates to certain treasurers placed within these three pyramids to guard their contents, and, like all or most of what I have already quoted, was a work of imagination. Ibn Abd al-Qom, in fact, was a romancist of the first water. Perhaps the strongest argument against the theory that the pyramids were intended as strongholds for the concealment of treasure resides in the fact that, search being made, no treasure has been discovered. When the workmen employed by Caliph al-Mamun, after encountering manifold difficulties, at length broke their way into the great ascending passage leading to the so-called King's Chamber, they found a right noble apartment, 34 feet long, 17 broad, and 19 high, of polished red granite throughout walls, floor, and ceiling, in blocks squared and true, and put together with such exquisite skill that the joints are barely discernible to the closest inspection. But where is the treasure, the silver and the gold, the jewels, medicines, and arms? These fanatics look wildly around them, but can see nothing, not a single dirham anywhere. They trim their torches and carry them again and again to every part of that red-walled. Time equals 1,200 milliseconds greater than Flinty Hall, but without any better success. Naught but pure polished red granite in mighty slabs looks upon them from every side. The room is clean, garnished too, as it were, and, according to the ideas of its founders, complete and perfectly ready for its visitors so long expected, so long delayed. But the gross minds who occupy it now find it all barren and declare that there is nothing whatever for them in the whole extent of the apartment from one end to another. Nothing except an empty stone chest without a lid. It is, however, to be noted that we have no means of learning what had happened between the time when the pyramid was built and when Caliph al-Mamun's workmen broke their way into the king's chamber. The place may, after all, have contained treasures of some kind, nor, indeed, is it incompatible with other theories of the pyramid to suppose that it was used as a safe receptacle for treasures. It is certain, however, that this cannot have been the special purpose for which the pyramids were designed. We should find in such a purpose no explanation whatever of any of the most stringent difficulties encountered in dealing with other theories. There could be no reason why strangers from the East should be at special pains to instruct an Egyptian monarch how to hide and guard his treasures. Time equals 3,500 milliseconds greater than Noor. If the Great Pyramid had been intended to receive the treasures of Cheops, would Chephren have built another for his own treasures, which must have included those gathered by Cheops? But apart from this, how inconceivably vast must a treasure hoard be supposed to be, the safeguarding of which would have repaid the enormous cost of the Great Pyramid in labor and material. And then, Why should a mere treasure house have the characteristics of an astronomical observatory? Manifestly, if the pyramids were used at all to receive treasures, it can only have been as an entirely subordinate, though perhaps convenient means of utilizing these gigantic structures. Having thus gone through all the suggested purposes of the pyramids, save 2 or 3, which clearly do not possess any claim to serious consideration, and having found none which appear to give any sufficient account of the history and principal features of these buildings, we must either abandon the inquiry or seek for some explanation quite different from any yet suggested. Let us consider what are the principal points of which the true theory of the pyramids should give an account. In the first place, the history of the pyramids shows that the erection of the first Great Pyramid was in all probability either suggested to Cheops by wise men who visited Egypt from the east, or else some important information conveyed to him by such visitors caused him to conceive the idea of building the pyramid. In either case, we may suppose, as the history indeed suggests, time equals 1,200 milliseconds, that these learned men, whoever they may have been, remained in Egypt to superintend the erection of the structure. It may be that the architectural work was not under their supervision. In fact, it seems altogether unlikely that shepherd rulers would have much to teach the Egyptians in the matter of architecture. But the astronomical peculiarities which form so significant a feature of the Great Pyramid were probably provided for entirely under the instructions of the shepherd chiefs, who had exerted so strange an influence upon the mind of King Cheops. Next, it seems clear that self-interest must have been the predominant reason in the mind of the Egyptian king for undertaking this stupendous work. It is true that his change of religion implies that some higher cause influenced him. But a ruler who could inflict such grievous burdens on his people in carrying out his purpose that for ages afterwards his name was held in utter detestation, cannot have been solely or even chiefly influenced by religious motives. It affords an ample explanation of the behavior of Cheops in closing the temples and forsaking the religion of his country, to suppose that the advantages which he hoped to secure by building the pyramid depended in some way on his adopting this course. The visitors from the East may have refused to give their assistance on any other terms, or may have assured him that the expected benefit could not be obtained if the pyramid were erected by idolaters. It is certain, in any case, that they were opposed to idolatry. Time equals, quote, 3,500 milliseconds, quote, / greater than. And we have thus some means of inferring who they were and whence they came. We know that one particular branch of one particular race in the East was characterized by a most marked hatred of idolatry in all its forms. Terah and his family, or probably a sect or division of the Chaldean people, went forth from Ur of the Chaldees to go into the land of Canaan. And the reason why they went forth we learn from a book of considerable historical interest, the book of Judith, to have been because they would not worship the gods of their fathers who were in the land of the Chaldeans. The Bible record shows that members of this branch of the Chaldean people visited Egypt from time to time. They were shepherds too, which accords well with the account of Herodotus above quoted. We can well understand that persons of this family would have resisted all endeavors to secure their acquiescence in any scheme associated with idolatrous rites. Neither promises nor threats would have had much influence on them. It was a distinguished member of the family, the patriarch Abraham, who said, "I have lifted up mine hand unto the Lord, the Most High God, the possessor of heaven and earth, that I will not take from a thread even to a shoe latchet, and that I will not take anything that is thine, lest thou shouldest say, I have made Abram rich." Vain would all the promises and all the threats of Cheops have been to men of this spirit. Time equals, quote, 3,500 milliseconds, quote, /. Such men might help him in his plans, suggested, as the history shows, by teachings of their own, but it must be on their own conditions, and those conditions would most certainly include the utter rejection of idolatrous worship by the king, in whose behalf they worked, as well as by all who shared in their labors. It seems probable that they convinced both Cheops and Chephron that unless these kings gave up idolatry, the purpose, whatever it was, which the pyramid was erected to promote, would not be fulfilled. The mere fact that the Great Pyramid was built either directly at the suggestion of these visitors, or because they had persuaded Cheops of the truth of some important doctrine, shows that they must have gained great influence over his mind. Rather, we may say that he must have been so convinced of their knowledge and power as to have accepted with unquestioning confidence all that they told him respecting the particular subject over which they seemed to possess so perfect a mastery. But having formed the opinion on grounds sufficiently assured that the strangers who visited Egypt and superintended the building of the Great Pyramid were kinsmen of the patriarch Abraham, it is not very difficult to decide what was the subject respecting which they had such exact information. They or their parents had come from the land of the Chaldeans, and they were doubtless learned in all the wisdom of their Chaldean kinsmen. They were masters. Time equals 1,200 milliseconds greater than, in fact, of the astronomy of their day, a science for which the Chaldeans had shown from the earliest ages the most remarkable aptitude. What the actual extent of their astronomical knowledge may have been, it would be difficult to say. But it is certain, from the exact knowledge which later Chaldeans possessed respecting long astronomical cycles, that astronomical observations must have been carried on continuously by that people for many hundreds of years. It is highly probable that the astronomical knowledge of the Chaldeans in the days of Terah and Abraham was much more accurate than that possessed by the Greeks even after the time of Hipparchus. We see indeed in the accurate astronomical adjustment of the Great Pyramid that the architects must have been skillful astronomers and mathematicians, and I may note here, in passing, how strongly this circumstance confirms the opinion that the visitors were kinsmen of Terah and Abraham. All we know from Herodotus and Manetho, all the evidence from the circumstances connected with the religion of the Pyramid Kings, and the astronomical evidence given by the pyramids themselves tends to assure us that members of that particular branch of the Chaldean family, which went out from Ur of the Chaldees, because they would not worship the gods of the Chaldeans, extended their wanderings to Egypt, and eventually superintended the erection of the Great Pyramid, so far as astronomical and mathematical relations were concerned. But not only have we already decided that the pyramids were not intended solely or chiefly to subserve the purpose of astronomical observatories, but it is certain that Cheops would not have been personally much interested in any astronomical information which these visitors might be able to communicate. Unless he saw clearly that something was to be gained from the lore of his visitors, he would not have undertaken to erect any astronomical buildings at their suggestion, even if he had cared enough for their knowledge to pay any attention to them whatever. Most probably the reply Cheops would have made to any communications respecting mere astronomy would have run much in the style of the reply made by the Turkish Qadi, Imam Ali Zadeh, to a friend of Layard's who had apparently bored him about double stars and comets. "O my soul, O my lamb," said Ali, "Zadeh, seek not after the things which concern thee not. Thou camest unto us, and we welcomed thee. Go in peace. Of a truth thou hast spoken many words, and there is no harm done, for the speaker is one, and the listener is another. After the fashion of thy people thou hast wandered from one place to another, until thou art happy and content in none. Listen, O my son, there is no wisdom equal unto the belief in God. He created the world, and shall we liken ourselves unto him in seeking to penetrate into the mysteries of his creation? Shall we say, Behold, this star spinneth round that star, and this other star with a tail goeth and cometh in so many years? Let it go. He from whose hand it came will guide and direct it. But thou wilt say unto me, Stand aside, O man, for I am more learned than thou art, and have seen more things. If thou thinkest that thou art in this respect better than I am, thou art welcome. I praise God that I seek not that which I require not. Thou art learned in the things I care not for. And as for that which thou hast seen, I defile it. Will much knowledge create thee a double belly, or wilt thou seek paradise with thine eyes? Such, omitting the references to the Creator, would probably have been the reply of Cheops to his visitors, had they only had astronomical facts to present him with, or, in the plenitude of his kingly power, he might have more decisively rejected their teaching by removing their heads. But the shepherd astronomers had knowledge more attractive to offer than a mere series of astronomical discoveries. Their ancestors had watched from the centers of their sleeping flocks. Those radiant Mercuries that seem to move, carrying through ether in perpetual round decrees and resolutions of the gods. And though the visitors of King Cheops had themselves rejected the Sabaistic polytheism of their kinsmen, they had not rejected the doctrine that the stars in their courses affect the fortunes of men. We know that among the Jews, probably the direct descendants of the shepherd chiefs who visited Cheops, and certainly close kinsmen of theirs, and akin to them also in their monotheism, the belief in astrology was never regarded as a superstition. In fact, we can trace very clearly in the books relating to this people that they believed confidently in the influences of the heavenly bodies. Doubtless, the visitors of King Cheops shared the belief of their Chaldean kinsmen that astrology is a true science, founded, indeed, as Bacon expresses their views, not in reason and physical contemplations, but in the direct experience and observation of past ages. Josephus records the Jewish tradition, though not as a tradition but as a fact, that our first father, Adam, was instructed in astrology by divine inspiration, and that Seth so excelled in the science that, foreseeing the flood and the destruction of the world thereby, he engraved the fundamental principles of his art, astrology, in hieroglyphical emblems for the benefit of after ages on 2 pillars of brick and stone. He says farther on that the patriarch Abraham, having learned the art in Chaldea, when he journeyed into Egypt, taught the Egyptians the sciences of arithmetic and astrology. Indeed, the stranger called Philetus by Herodotus may, for aught that appears, have been Abraham himself, for it is generally agreed that the word Philetus indicated the race and country of the visitors, regarded by the Egyptians as of Philistine descent and arriving from Palestine. However, I am in no way concerned to show that the shepherd astronomers who induced Cheops to build the Great Pyramid were even contemporaries of Abraham and Melchizedek. What seems sufficiently obvious is all that I care to maintain, namely that these shepherd astronomers were of Chaldean birth and training, and therefore astrologers, though unlike their Chaldean kinsmen, they rejected Sabaism or star worship, and taught the belief in one only deity. Now, if these visitors were astrologers who persuaded Cheops and were honestly convinced themselves that they could predict the events of any man's life by the Chaldean method of casting nativities, we can readily understand many circumstances connected with the pyramids which have hitherto seemed inexplicable. The pyramid built by a king would no longer be regarded as having reference to his death and burial, but to his birth and life, though after his death it might receive his body. Each king would require to have his own nativity pyramid, built with due symbolical reference to the special celestial influences affecting his fortunes. Every portion of the work would have to be carried out under special conditions, determined according to the mysterious influences ascribed to the different planets and their varying positions, now high, now low, then hid, progressive, retrograde, or standing still. Time equals, quote, 3,500 milliseconds, quote, / greater than. If the work had been intended only to afford the means of predicting the king's future, the labor would have been regarded by the monarch as well bestowed. But astrology involved much more than the mere prediction of future events. Astrologers claimed the power of ruling the planets. That is, of course, not of ruling the motions of those bodies, but of providing against evil influences or strengthening good influences, which they supposed the celestial orbs to exert in particular aspects. Thus we can understand that while the mere basement layers of the pyramid would have served for the process of casting the royal nativity with due mystic observances, the further progress of building the pyramid would supply the necessary means and indications for ruling the planets most potent in their influence upon the royal career. Remembering the mysterious influence which astrologers ascribe to special numbers, figures, positions, and so forth, the care with which the Great Pyramid was so proportioned as to indicate particular astronomical and mathematical relations is at once explained. The 4 sides of the square base were carefully placed with reference to the cardinal points, precisely like the 4 sides of the ordinary square scheme of nativity. The eastern side faced the ascendant, the southern faced the mid-heaven, the western faced the descendant, and the northern faced the Imum Coeli. Again, we can understand that the architects would have made a circuit of the base, correspond in length with the number of days in the year, a relation which, according to Professor P. Smith, is fulfilled in this manner, that the four sides contain 100 times as many pyramid inches as there are days in the year. The pyramid inch, again, is itself mystically connected with astronomical relations, for its length is equal to the 500 millionth part of the Earth's diameter, to a degree of exactness corresponding well with what we might expect Chaldean astronomers to attain. Professor Smith, indeed, believes that it was exactly equal to that proportion of the Earth's polar diameter, a view which would correspond with his theory that the architects of the Great Pyramid were assisted by divine inspiration. But what is certainly known about the sacred cubit, which contained 25 of these inches, corresponds better with the diameter which the Chaldean astronomers, if they worked very carefully, would have deduced from observations made in their own country, on the supposition which they would naturally have made that the Earth is a perfect globe, not compressed at the poles. It is not indeed at all certain that the sacred cubit bore any reference to the Earth's dimensions, but this seems tolerably well made out, that the sacred cubit was about some inches in length, and that the circuit of the pyramid's base contained 100 inches for every day of the year. Relations such as these are precisely what we might expect to find in buildings having an astrological significance. Similarly, it would correspond well with the mysticism of astrology that the pyramid should be so proportioned as to make the height be the radius of a circle, whose circumference would equal the circuit of the pyramid's base. Again, that long slant tunnel leading downwards from the pyramid's northern face would at once find a meaning in this astrological theory. The slant tunnel pointed to the pole star of Cheops' time, when due north below the true pole of the heavens. This circumstance had no observational utility. It could afford no indication of time, because a pole star moves very slowly, and the pole star of Cheops' day must have been in view through that tunnel for more than an hour at a time. But apart from the mystical significance which an astrologer would attribute to such a relation, it may be shown that this slant tunnel is precisely what the astrologer would require in order to get the horoscope correctly. Another consideration remains to be mentioned, which, while strengthening the astrological theory of the pyramids, may bring us even nearer to the true aim of those who planned and built these structures. It is known also that the Chaldeans from the earliest times pursued the study of alchemy in connection with astrology, not hoping to discover the philosopher's stone by chemical investigations alone, but by carrying out such investigations under special celestial influence. The hope of achieving this discovery, by which he would at once have had the means of acquiring illimitable wealth, would of itself account for the fact that Cheops expended so much labor and material in the erection of the Great Pyramid, seeing that, of necessity, success in the search for the philosopher's stone would be a main feature of his fortunes, and would therefore be astrologically indicated in his nativity pyramid, or perhaps even be secured by following mystical observances proper for ruling his planets. The elixir of life may also have been among the objects which the builders of the pyramids hoped to discover. It may be noticed, as a somewhat significant circumstance that in the account given by Ibn Abd al-Qurm of the contents of the various pyramids, those assigned to the Great Pyramid relate entirely to astrology and associated mysteries. It is, of course, clear that Abd al-Qurm drew largely on his imagination. Yet it seems probable that there was also some basis of tradition for his ideas. And certainly one would suppose that as he assigned a treasurer to the East Pyramid, a statue of black agate, his eyes open and glowing, sitting on a throne with a lance, he would have credited the building with treasure also, had not some tradition taught otherwise. But he says that King saw it placed in the East Pyramid, not treasures, but divers celestial spheres and stars, and what they severally operate in their aspects, and the perfumes which are to be used to them, and the books which treat of these matters. But after all, it must be admitted that the strongest evidence in favor of the astrological and alchemical theory of the pyramids is to be found in the circumstance that all other theories seem untenable. The pyramids were undoubtedly erected for some purpose which was regarded by their builders as most important. This purpose certainly related to the personal fortunes of the kingly builders. It was worth an enormous outlay of money, labor, and material. This purpose was such, furthermore, that each king required to have his own pyramid. It was in some way associated with astronomy, for the pyramids are built with most accurate reference to celestial aspects. It also had its mathematical and mystical bearings, seeing that the pyramids exhibit mathematical and symbolical peculiarities not belonging to their essentially structural requirements. And lastly, the erection of the pyramids was in some way connected with the arrival of certain learned persons from Palestine, and presumably of Chaldean origin. All these circumstances accord well with the theory I have advanced, while only some of them, and these not the most characteristic, accord with any of the other theories. Moreover, no fact known respecting the pyramids or their builders is inconsistent with the astrological and alchemical theory. On the whole, then, if it cannot be regarded as demonstrated in its general bearing, of course, for we cannot expect any theory about the pyramids to be established in minute details, the astrological theory may fairly be described as having a greater degree of probability in its favor than any hitherto advanced. In this next quiet passage, Swedenborg's Visions of Other Worlds. If it were permitted to men to select a sign whereby they should know that a message came from the Supreme Being, probably the man of science would select for the sign the communication of some scientific fact beyond the knowledge of the day, but admitting of being readily put to the test. The evidence thus obtained in favor of a revelation would correspond in some sense to that depending on prophecies, but it would be more satisfactory to men having that particular mental bent which is called the scientific. Whether this turn of mind is inherent or the result of training, it certainly leads men of science to be more exacting in considering the value of evidence than any men, except perhaps lawyers. In the case of the student of science, St. Paul's statement that prophecies shall fail has been fulfilled, whereas it may be doubted whether evidence from knowledge would in like manner vanish away. On the contrary, it would grow stronger and stronger as knowledge from observation, from experiment, and from calculation continually increased. It can scarcely be said that this has happened with such quasi-scientific statements as have actually been associated with revelation. If we regard St. Paul's reference to knowledge as relating to such statements as these, then nothing could be more complete than the fulfillment of his own prediction. Whether there be prophecies, they shall fail. Whether there be tongues, they shall cease. Whether there be knowledge, it shall vanish away. The evidence from prophecies fails for the exact inquirer, who perceives the doubts which exist among the most earnest believers as to the exact meaning of the prophetic words, and even in some cases as to whether prophecies have been long since fulfilled or relate to events still to come. The evidence from tongues has ceased, and those are dust who are said to have spoken in strange tongues. The knowledge which was once thought supernatural has utterly vanished away. But if, in the ages of faith, some of the results of modern scientific research had been revealed, as the laws of the solar system, the great principle of the conservation of energy, or the wave theory of light, or if some of the questions which still remain for men of science to solve had been answered in those times, the evidence for the student of science would have been irresistible. Of course, he will be told that even then he would have hardened his heart. Time equals 3,500 milliseconds, that the inquiry, after truth tending naturally to depravity of mind, he would reject even evidence based on his beloved laws of probability. That his wicked and adulterous generation seeketh in vain after a sign, and that if he will not accept Moses and the prophets, neither would he believe, though one rose from the dead. Still, the desire of the student of science to base his faith on convincing evidence in a matter as important to him as to those who abuse him does seem to have something reasonable in it after all. The mental qualities which cause him to be less easily satisfied than others came to him in the same way as his bodily qualities. And even if the result to which his mental training leads him is as unfortunate as some suppose, that training is not, strictly speaking, so heinously sinful that nothing short of the eternal reprobation meted out to him by earthly judges can satisfy divine justice, so that it may be thought not a wholly unpardonable sin to speak of a sign which, had it been accorded, would have satisfied even the most exacting student of science. Apart, too, from all question of faith, the mere scientific interest of divinely inspired communications respecting natural laws and processes would justify a student of science in regarding them as most desirable messages from a being of superior wisdom and benevolence. If prophecies and tongues, why not knowledge as evidence of a divine mission? Such thoughts are suggested by the claim of some religious teachers to the possession of knowledge other than that which they could have gained by natural means. The claim has usually been quite honest. The teacher of religion tests the reality of his mission in simple, a priori confidence that he has such a mission, and that therefore some one or other of the tests he applies will afford the required evidence. To one, says St. Paul, is given the word of wisdom, to another the word of knowledge, to another faith, to another the gift of healing, to another the working of miracles, to another prophecy, to another the discerning of spirits, to another time equals 1,200 milliseconds / greater than divers kinds of tongues, and so forth. If a man like Muhammad, who believes in his mission to teach, finds that he cannot satisfactorily work miracles, that mountains will not be removed at his bidding, then some other evidence satisfies him of the reality of his mission. Swedenborg, than whom perhaps no more honest man ever lived, said and believed that to him had been granted the discerning of spirits. It is to be observed, he said, that a man may be instructed by spirits and angels if his interiors be so open as to enable him to speak and be in company with them. For man in his essence is a spirit, and is with spirits as to his interiors, so that he whose interiors are opened by the Lord may converse with them, as man with man. This privilege I have enjoyed daily now for 12 years. It indicates the fullness of Swedenborg's belief in this privilege that he did not hesitate to describe what the spirits taught him respecting matters which belong rather to science than to faith. Though it must be admitted that probably he supposed there was small reason for believing that his statements could ever be tested by the results of scientific research. The objects to which his spiritual communications related were conveniently remote. I do not say this as desiring for one moment to suggest that he purposely selected those objects, and not others which might be more readily examined. He certainly believed in the reality of the communications he described, but possibly there is some law in things visionary, corresponding to the law of mental operation with regard to scientific theories, and as the mind theorizes freely about a subject little understood, but cautiously where many facts have been ascertained, so probably exact knowledge of a subject prevents the operation of those illusions which are regarded as supernatural communications. It is in a dim light only that the active imagination pictures objects which do not really exist. In the clear light of day, they can no longer be imagined. So it is with mental processes. Probably there is no subject more suitable in this sense for the visionary than that of life in other worlds. It has always had an attraction for imaginative minds, simply because it is enwrapped in so profound a mystery. And there has been little to restrain the fancy, because so little is certainly known of the physical condition of other worlds. Recently, indeed, a somewhat sudden and severe check has been placed on the liveliness of imagination, which had enabled men formerly to picture to themselves the inhabitants of other orbs in space. Spectroscopic analysis and exact telescopic scrutiny will not permit some speculations to be entertained which formerly met with favor. Yet even now there has been but a slight change of scene and time. If men can no longer imagine inhabitants of one planet because it is too hot, or of another because it is too crisp, of one body because it is too deeply immersed in vaporous masses, time equals 1,200 milliseconds, or of another because it has neither atmosphere nor water, we have only to speculate about the unseen worlds which circle round those other suns, the stars. Or, instead of changing the region of space where we imagine worlds, we can look backward to the time when planets now crisp and dead were warm with life, or forward to the distant future when planets now glowing with fiery heat shall have cooled down to a habitable condition. Swedenborg's imaginative mind seems to have fully felt the charm of this interesting subject. It was, indeed, because of the charm which he found in it, that he was readily persuaded into the belief that knowledge had been supernaturally communicated to him respecting it. Because I had a desire, he says, to know if there are other earths and to learn their nature and the character of their inhabitants. It was granted me by the Lord to converse and have intercourse with spirits and angels who had come from other earths, with some for a day, with some for a week, and with some for months. From them I have received information respecting the earths from and near which they are, the modes of life, customs, and worship of their inhabitants, besides various other particulars of interest, all which, having come to my knowledge in this way, I can describe as things which I have seen and heard. It is interesting, psychologically, to notice how the reasoning which had convinced Swedenborg of the existence of other inhabited worlds is attributed by him to the spirits. It is well known in the other life, he says, that there are many earths with men upon them. For there, that is, in the spiritual life, everyone who, from a love of truth and consequent use, desires it, is allowed to converse with the spirits of other earths so as to be assured that there is a plurality of worlds, and be informed that the human race is not confined to one earth only, but extends to numberless earths. I have occasionally conversed on this subject with the spirits of our earth, and the result of our conversation was that a man of enlarged understanding may conclude from various considerations that there are many earths with human inhabitants upon them. For it is an inference of reason that masses so great as the planets are, some of which exceed this earth in magnitude, are not empty bodies, created only to be carried in their motion round the sun, and to shine with their scanty light for the benefit of one earth only, but that they must have a nobler use. He who believes, as everyone ought to believe, that the deity created the universe for no other end than the existence of the human race and of heaven from it, for the human race is the seminary of heaven, must also believe that wherever there is an earth there are human inhabitants, that the planets which are visible to us, being within the boundary of our solar system, are earths, may appear from various considerations. They are bodies of earthy matter because they reflect the sun's light, and when seen through the telescope appear, not as stars glowing with a flaming luster, but as earths variegated with obscure spots. Like our earth, they are carried round the sun by a progressive motion through the path of the zodiac, whence they have years and seasons of the year, which are spring, summer, autumn, and winter, and they rotate upon their axis, which makes days and times of the day, as morning, midday, evening, and night. Some of them also have satellites, which perform their revolutions about their globes, as the moon does about ours. The planet Saturn, as being farthest from the sun, has besides an immense luminous ring, which supplies that earth with much, though reflected, light. How is it possible for anyone acquainted with these facts, and who thinks from reason, to assert that such bodies are uninhabited? Remembering that this reasoning was urged by the spirits, and that during 12 years Swedenborg's interiors had been opened in such sort that he could converse with spirits from other worlds, it is surprising that he should have heard nothing about Uranus or Neptune, to say nothing of the zone of asteroids, or again of planets as yet unknown, which may exist outside the path of Neptune. He definitely commits himself, it will be observed, to the statement that Saturn is the planet farthest from the sun, and elsewhere, in stating where in these spiritual communications the idea of each planet was conceived to be situated. He leaves no room whatever for Uranus and Neptune, and makes no mention of other bodies in the solar system than those known in his day. This cannot have been because the spirits from then unknown planets did not feel themselves called upon to communicate with the spirit of one who knew nothing of their home, for he received visitors from worlds in the starry heavens far beyond human ken. Oh, it would almost seem, though to the faithful Swedenborgian the thought will doubtless appear very wicked, that the system of Swedenborg gave no place to Uranus and Neptune, simply because he knew nothing about those planets. Otherwise, what a noble opportunity there would have been for establishing the truth of Swedenborgian doctrines by revealing to the world the existence of planets hitherto unknown. Before the reader pronounces this a task beneath the dignity of the spirits and angels who taught Swedenborg, it will be well for him to examine the news which they actually imparted. I may as well premise, however, that it does not seem to me worthwhile to enter here at any length into Swedenborg's descriptions of the inhabitants of other worlds, because what he has to say on this subject is entirely imaginative. There is a real interest for us in his ideas respecting the condition of the planets, because those ideas were based, though unconsciously, upon the science of his day, in which he was no mean proficient. And even where his mysticism went beyond what his scientific attainments suggested, a psychological interest attaches to the workings of his imagination. It is as curious a problem to trace his ideas to their origin as it sometimes is to account for the various phases of a fantastic dream. Such a dream, for instance, for time equals 1,200 milliseconds as that which Armadale, the Doctor, and Midwinter in Armadale endeavor to connect with preceding events. But Swedenborg's visions of the behavior and appearance of the inhabitants of other Earths have little interest, because it is hopeless to attempt to account for even their leading features. For instance, what can we make of such a passage as the following, relating to the spirits who came from Mercury? Some of them are desirous to appear, not like the spirits of other Earths as men, but as crystalline globes. Their desire to appear so, although they do not, arises from the circumstance that the knowledges of things immaterial are in the other life, represented by crystals. Yet some, even of these more fanciful visions, significantly indicate the nature of Swedenborg's philosophy. One can recognize his disciples and his opponents among the inhabitants of various favored and unhappy worlds, and one perceives how the wiser and more dignified of his spiritual visitors are made to advocate his own views and to deride those of his adversaries. Some of the teachings thus circuitously advanced are excellent. For instance, Swedenborg's description of the inhabitants of Mercury and their love of abstract knowledge contains an instructive lesson. The spirits of Mercury imagine, he says, that they know so much that it is almost impossible to know more. But it has been told them by the spirits of our earth that they do not know many things but few, and that the things which they know not are comparatively infinite, and in relation to those they do know are as the waters of the largest ocean to those of the smallest fountain. And further, that the first advance to wisdom is to know, acknowledge, and perceive that what we do know compared with what we do not know is so little as hardly to amount to anything. So far, We may suppose that Swedenborg presents his own ideas, seeing that he is describing what has been told the mercurial spirits by the spirits of our earth, of whom, during these spiritual conversations, he was one. But he proceeds to describe how angels were allowed to converse with the mercurial spirits in order to convince them of their error. I saw another angel, says he, after describing one such conversation, conversing with them. He appeared at some altitude to the right. He was from our earth, and he enumerated very many things of which they were ignorant. As they had been proud on account of their knowledges, on hearing this they began to humble themselves. Their humiliation was represented by the sinking of the company which they formed, for that company then appeared as a volume or roll, as if hollowed in the middle and raised at the sides. They were told what that signified, that is, what they thought in their humiliation, and that those who appeared elevated at the sides were not as yet in any humiliation. Then I saw that the volume was separated, and that those who were not in humiliation were remanded back towards their earth, the rest remaining. Little being known to Swedenborg, as indeed little is known to the astronomers of our own time about Mercury, we find little in the visions relating to that planet which possesses any scientific interest. He asked the